Hopefully by this point you haven't been too bored, and we're going to go ahead and try to put all of this together. I'm going to have some rhythm strips now that we're going to go over that you're going to be able to actually look at, and I'm going to write on them so that way you can kind of see what I'm looking at as we actually go through this. So let's go ahead and put this all together. I want you to go ahead and interpret this rhythm. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and look at my atrial rate. Well, just by looking at my atrial rate, I need to see if I have any P waves. Unfortunately, I don't have P waves in this rhythm. This particular rhythm does not actually show any kind of P waves. So what I'm going to write down for my atrial rate here, that's what the A stands for, is currently I'm going to write down unknown. Later, when we talk about this particular rhythm, you will write down a different word. But let's go ahead and look at my ventricular rate. What is my ventricular rate going to be? Well, if I want to use the 6-second method, which is the easiest method, I'm going to go ahead and start over here. Here's my line, so I'm not going to count that one. I'm going to count 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120. So my ventricular rate is about 120 beats per minute. Now let's look at my regularity. How would you identify the regularity of this particular rhythm? Well, I would actually identify the regularity of this particular rhythm as irregular, only because if you go through and you actually count all the little boxes in between each one of these QRS complexes, there is no pattern to it whatsoever. So my actual determination of the regularity of this rhythm is going to be irregular. Looking at my P waves, do I have any P waves in this situation? Of course I don't. There are no P waves whatsoever, so I'm going to say P waves are absent. Since I don't have a P wave, I can't have a PR interval if I don't have a P wave because there's no P. So I'm going to say my PR interval is absent. Now my QRS complex, what I want to do for my QRS complex is I want to look at it. For the actual interpretation of my QRS complex, I do not want to have normal or abnormal. I don't actually want to see one of these right here. What I want to see is the actual duration of the QRS complex. And if I look up here, the actual duration of my QRS complex, if I can find a nice easy one, we're going to go ahead and use this one right here. I'm going to say my QRS complex starts here, ends right about here. That gives me about 3 little boxes. So my QRS complex, I'm actually going to say is 0.12 seconds, which is actually going to be wide. So I'm going to go ahead and use all of this information here, and then I'm going to interpret the rhythm. Now, I'm not going to write down the interpretation of the rhythm right here because really we're not quite there yet. What I want you to concentrate on is determining the rate, the regularity, the P wave, the PR interval, and the QRS complex. So let's look at another one. In this case, what is my atrial rate going to be? Well, if I use the 6-second method or the 1500 method or the 300 method, I'll come out generally the same. But I'm going to go ahead and use the 6-second method because that's the easiest to use right now. I do not have a P wave that occurs, or this P wave does not occur before this line, after this line, so I'm going to use that line here, and I'm going to count how many P waves I actually have. 1, 2, 3, 4. So my actual atrial rate is going to be 40 beats per minute. Now I'm going to look at my ventricular rate. My ventricular rate is going to be a little bit faster. My ventricular rate is going to be 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now my ventricular rate is going to be 40 also. This is an interesting situation where you actually have your ventricular rate and your atrial rate match up, even though there is a missing QRS complex right here. We have a huge QRS complex that should be here and it's not. If I were to have a much longer strip where I can get a real determination of both my atrial and ventricular rates, I would actually see that my ventricular rate is slower than my atrial rate. Now I'm going to go ahead and look at my regularity, and as you can see here, it looks irregular. I'm betting that this is a patterned irregularity, but I can't really tell that right now, so I'm just going to go ahead and write this down as irregular. Now look at my P waves. Do I have P waves? Are they upright, round, and normal? For the most part, they are. They're upright, and for the most part, they're round, and they're kind of normal. So I'm going to go ahead and say that my P waves are actually normal. My PR interval, I'm going to notice over here my PR interval is a specific PR interval. So I'm going to start here with my PR interval, and I'm going to go to right here, and that's going to give me, this PR interval here is actually going to give me 0.24 seconds. This PR interval is going to start right here. It's going to actually end right here. That's going to be about 0.24 seconds as well. This PR interval is going to be a little bit longer. It's going to start here. It's going to end way out here. So this is actually going to be 0.28. So as you can see here, my PR interval is actually widening. So I'm going to have my PR interval widening from 0.24 to 0.28 seconds, because we're always labeling our numbers now that we're in medicine. The QRS complex is going to be normal. Although it looks a little weird, I know that my QRS complex is less than 0.12 seconds. Just by looking at this, it looks like it's about 0.10 seconds, so my QRS complex is normal. I'm not going to worry about my interpretation as of right now because I don't want you guys to worry about that. Just make sure that you have all of the other material down very well. Now let's go ahead and look at another rhythm that we actually have here. What is my atrial rate versus my ventricular rate? Well, I'm going to go ahead and use my 6-second method. First, I'm going to determine my rate. Just by glancing at it, it looks slow. So I'm going to bet that that right there going over is going to be my atrial rate. Let's go ahead and start with my atrial rate. I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4. So my atrial rate is going to be 40 beats per minute. What's my ventricular rate? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. My ventricular rate is actually going to be 50 beats per minute, which tells me that there's a disconnect there. The reality is it looks like that these P waves are all married to the QRSs. The only reason I have a 40 and a 50 here is because the 6-second method throws it off. If I were to do the 1500 or the 300 method, I guarantee you it'll all come out to be the exact same heart rates. My regularity, if I were to look at the regularity of the rhythm and use calipers, a piece of paper, or count the little boxes, I would find that the rhythm is actually regular. My P waves, as you can see, are in front of the QRS. They're married to the QRS. They're upright and they're round. So I'm going to say that the P waves are normal. My PR interval, I'm going to look up here at my PR interval. I'm going to have that line there and that line there. That looks like my PR interval is 0.12 seconds, and it's constant. And now I'm going to look at my QRS complexes. If I look at my QRS complex, it begins there, ends there. Looks like my QRS complex is 0.10 seconds in this case, which is all normal. Here's another rhythm that's actually very irregular, but that's the first thing I see with this rhythm. Let's go ahead and get an atrial rate. Well, to have an atrial rate, we need to have P waves. I don't have P waves, so I'm going to go ahead and say that the atrial rate is unknown. The ventricular rate, on the other hand, I can do. Now, I'm going to go ahead and use the 6-second method here, and I'm going to start over here all the way to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So I'm going to add a 0 behind that. I'm going to say my ventricular rate is approximately 130 beats per minute. My regularity, if you were to actually take your calipers and look at this, you would find that there is no regularity whatsoever. There is no pattern at all. So I'm going to be irregular. My P wave, I don't have a P wave, so I'm going to put that that's absent. My PR interval is absent because I don't have a P wave. My QRS complex, if I were to try to look at my QRS complex, I would actually start right about here and I would end right about here. It might actually look normal, so it looks like that it's going to be about 0.10 seconds. When I glance at this rhythm, the first thing that I actually see is that the rhythm looks incredibly slow, especially the ventricular rhythm, the ventricular rate. If I start off with the atrial rate here, I can try to do the 6-second method, but the problem with doing a 6-second method in this particular strip is that I'm actually going to have P waves buried somewhere in these QRS complexes. I'm not really sure where. So what I can also do is use the 300, 1500, or the countdown method. I'm going to use the countdown method and say that this is where I'm starting. So there's 300, 150. So it looks like that my atrial rate is actually, I'm going to go ahead and put at 120 beats per minute just for fun. I would have to do the math to find out what the actual rate is. Now I can use the ventricular rate in a 6-second method. So just by glancing at this, I'm going to know that my 6-second method is going to tell me that my ventricular rate is actually 30 beats per minute. That's quite a disconnect. I actually have 120 beats per minute atrial rate, but only 30 beats per minute ventricular rate. That is quite a bit of difference there. This is another particular type of rhythm that you'll be learning later on in the semester. Now let's go ahead and look at my regularity. We have to remember that the regularity applies to all rhythms. So as I look at my regularity, if you count the boxes or use your calipers between all of the QRS complexes, what you will actually see is that your rhythm is actually regular. When I look at the P waves themselves, though, I'm actually going to see that the P waves are normal for this particular rhythm, but what I am going to note that even though they're normal in size and duration, they're not married to the QRS complex. The PR interval. Well, since the P waves are not actually married to the QRS complex, you can't have a PR interval. So my PR interval is going to be absent. My QRS complex is actually wide and bizarre looking. If I were to try to count the actual milliseconds of the QRS complex, I'm going to use my first one over here. I'm going to say that my QRS complex begins right here. It ends up here. That's going to tell me that my QRS complex is actually 0.16 seconds, which is very wide. Based on all this information, would give me my interpretation. If we go ahead and try to interpret this rhythm right here, this rhythm is actually going to show me the atrial rate and the ventricular rate are very similar, if they're actually the exact same. I'm going to go ahead and use the countdown method in this case to try to figure out my atrial and ventricular rate. I know that my atrial rate begins right here, pretty close to this bold line. So I'm going to count from here, and I'm going to go 300, 150, 100, 75, 60. Now I know it's closer to 75, so just for fun, I'm going to go ahead and put 72 for my atrial rate. Now I know that my QRS complexes are very similar to that only because I can see that my P waves are causing my QRS complexes. But if I were to count my QRS complexes, I would actually come out to about 72 beats per minute as well. If I use my calipers to determine my regularity, I would determine that this rhythm is regular. My P waves are actually different. My P waves are inverted. Now if you remember, P waves, a normal P wave is supposed to be upright and round. This one is actually inverted, and it looks like it kind of does this peaking, inversion peaking here. The important thing is that it's actually inverted. It is not a normal P wave. But the question is, does this P wave cause the QRS complex? And the answer in this case is yes, it does. Because that P wave causes the QRS complex, then we're actually able to have a PR interval. Now the PR interval in this case is actually abnormal. If you were to look at the PR interval, it begins right about there and ends right about there. That's only two small boxes. So my PR interval is 0.08 seconds, which means I have a very narrow PR interval. Now you'll learn what that means later on in the semester, Don't worry about what it is now. Just realize that the PR interval is actually abnormal. Now let's look at the QRS complex. Is the QRS complex narrow? Yes, it is. My QRS complex is actually 0.10 seconds. It is narrow, it is steeply angled, and it has sharp points. So it is a very normal QRS complex. I hope this presentation will actually help you understand how to interpret a cardiac rhythm. Just remember that whenever you analyze a rhythm, you need to follow the normal 6-step process like you would any other type of assessment to determine what is wrong with something. Just remember to determine the rate, the regularity. You want to look at the P waves, look at the PR interval, look at the QRS complex, and then as we go through this class, you will be able to start to interpret the rhythm based on just that information.